And we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, welcome, everybody. So my name's Scott Miller. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm an LSAT instructor with Manhattan Prep. And this is tonight's January 8th, 2019 free prep hour. I really enjoy doing these free prep hours. I think it's kind of cool that we do this, that we just, and again, we have people who are here live tonight, and we also have people who are going to watch this on YouTube. So it's just a great opportunity to learn a little bit about the LSAT. We focus on specific topics. We do these twice a month. And there are some other good free resources that we have available. So you can go to our website. And what I'll do is at the end of the session tonight, I'll put a couple links in the website for some of our free resources. You can try join an actual live LSAT full 3-hour LSAT class for free, session 1 of any of our LSAT classes. We also have an interactive on-demand LSAT Interact course that you can try out, and just a lot of other good free resources that we have available. So I'll put some links in the chat window at the end of the session, and if you're watching the recording, there should be some in the recording information, those same links to some of our free resources on our website. In terms of what we're doing tonight, tonight's focus is going to be on timing strategy and how to use every minute effectively when you're taking a practice test or taking the real LSAT. Also call this Killing the LSAT Time Vampires. We're going to use questions from the June 2007 LSAT. The reason we do that is because it is available for free. You can download that from the LSAC website, or there's a link on our website where you can download that. And so we like to use questions from that prep test just because it's, it's one that everyone has available. So let's talk about timing on the LSAT. There are a couple of really common complaints that we hear from people when they talk about, working on LSAT questions. So one of them is people say, I can answer questions untimed when I just do them without timing myself. I don't have a problem. But I get a lot of questions wrong when I time myself. Or people always talk about running out of time at the end of the section. I mean, you guys have said you've taken the actual LSAT before, you've taken practice tests. How many of you have one of these problems? Or how many of you have specifically the bottom problem, where you're working on a section, working, and you get to the end and you run out of time before you can answer all the questions. And you end up having to just take a wild guess at the end. Yeah, I'm seeing a couple me's and yeses in the chat window. Okay, it's a pretty common problem, right? People run into. So how do we solve that? How do we deal with that? How do we solve that problem? You guys tell me in the chat window, how do we solve timing problems on the LSAT? How do we solve that problem of running out of time or having, and maybe you've already found a solution to this. Maybe you're already doing something that's successful that you would like to share. So how do we stop ourselves from running out of time at the end of the section or having trouble when you're working under time conditions? So practice more and build skills. That's one of the answers I see. What else? Just get more practice in. Okay. What else? What can you do to make sure that you can get through? Answering 23 to 28 questions in 35 minutes it's a pretty fast pace, right? So what are some specific things we can do to make sure that we get through and don't run out of time at the end, or that we can work effectively under time conditions? So I'll tell you, one of the things that people will say very often is, be familiar with all types of questions. Okay, that's another good one. Be familiar with types of questions. One of the things that people say is just work faster, right? That's a very common thing. You hear people say this a lot, that they, the goal or the objective that people think on the LSAT is just to be able to work as fast as possible and just plow through the 35-minute section and plow through these questions as fast as you can. That's a lot of times what people are asking, when they come to an LSAT class or when I'm tutoring someone or just answering questions, doing one of these free prep hours or whatever. People will say, how do I work faster? How do I get faster? And the problem is, when you try to work faster, that often leads to more mistakes. And a lot of people fall into this trap. You get this idea because you're working under these really strict time conditions and these very challenging time conditions, you think that you have to just work as fast as possible. So people will very often try to work faster. And then in that effort of trying to work faster, they end up just making more mistakes, which is not really productive. Yeah, you get through more questions. Maybe you get to the end of the sections, but you're still getting more questions wrong, as many or more questions wrong. This is not necessarily a solution. So what is the solution? The solution to a lot of timing issues is to use your time wisely. In an ideal LSAT performance, if you do a perfect job on the LSAT, you would spend every moment doing something that will help you increase your score. Every moment that you spend while the clock is ticking is going to be spent doing something that's going to earn you more points. Now, that maybe sounds really obvious, right? Of course, that's what we want to do. But if you think about it specifically, what we really mean here is you're trying to understand and identify times and points and ways that you're wasting time, because we all do it at some point to some extent. We all end up doing things that are unproductive. We all end up doing things that are just, we're spinning our wheels. We're wasting time. So you're trying to, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. How to identify the ways that we tend to waste time and the specific areas, the specific times when we tend to just sit there and spin our wheels. And how do we avoid doing that? And how do we have better methods, better processes in place to help us use our time more effectively? So that's what it's really all about, is not wasting time. So I'd like to talk about LSAT time vampires. I was actually going to do this lesson. I did one of these free prep hours back in October, and I thought, this, time vampires, that'd be a really good theme with Halloween coming up. And I even drew this cute little picture of a vampire here. I ended up doing something else in the October free prep hour. It was actually, we ended up doing a lesson on reading comprehension. So if you are interested in the reading comprehension section, go to our YouTube channel and look up one of those, the October free prep hour, where we talk about reading comprehension. Actually, a couple we did back late last year where we covered the reading comprehension section. So we didn't use my cute little vampire drawing for the Halloween lesson, but we are going to use it tonight. We're going to talk about how to kill the time. What are these time vampires that we run into on the LSAT, and how do we get rid of them? How do you identify them? What are the things that are going to suck up your time, and how do you deal with those? So let's go ahead and dive into an actual LSAT question. I'm going to show you a question. Again, this is from the June 2007 LSAT. And I'm going to give you 1 minute and 20 seconds to work on this question. So one thing that can be really useful to do is when you're working on a question, you're going to work along with us here, just on a piece of paper, on a piece of scrap paper. Maybe draw like a B, C, D, E. Just write out those letters on a piece of paper. And that way, when you're looking at this question on the screen, you can be like taking notes or crossing off, eliminating answer choices as you look at them. It's just a good way to, if you're not looking at this particular test on paper, if you're following along here on the screen, to work along with us as we work. So I'll show you this question. Go ahead and work on it on your own. I'll give you about 1 minute and 20 seconds to work on it, and then we'll talk about it. Here it is. All right. So that was about 1 minute and 20 seconds. So let's talk about this. How far did you get? If anybody has I was just going to say, if you have an answer to the question, if you came up with an answer, go ahead and put your answer in the chat window. Came up with an answer. And again, I see a couple people just showed up. If you just showed up, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says chat. You might have to click the button that says more with 3 dots, and then you'll see the selection to chat. But go ahead and select that chat window or open up that chat window and put your answer in the chat window if you have an answer. All right. So if you didn't come up with an answer yet, then again, how far did you get in the question? Did you get, were you looking at the answer choices? Did you get through reading the stimulus up here, the little paragraph up here? Were you working on the answer choices? Think about what point you were at when I said time's up, 1 minute and 20 seconds are up. So there are 2 really good ways to understand, how long it's taking you to answer LSAT questions. One is when you're working on a question like this, a single question, set a timer. So this is a question from the logical reasoning section. On average, you want to be doing these in about 1 minute and 20 seconds. That would be about your average time that you would have to answer one of these questions. So set a timer for 1 minute and 20 seconds. And when the timer goes off, see where you are. Another way to do this is just set a stopwatch running, a watch the clock that counts up. Work on the question all the way through, see how long it takes you to do it, and then see the total elapsed time, the total amount of time it takes. But you want to get an idea of how long it's taking you to answer these questions. And you're looking to get as close to 1 minute and 20 or under as you can. That would be the ideal. So with this particular type of question, how do we kill the time vampires on this question? How do we avoid wasting time? How do we work efficiently and effectively? So one of the most important ways is, and Serene, you mentioned earlier, being familiar with all types of questions. And that's going to be really important on the LSAT, to understand the different types of questions that you're being asked, and then have an effective process for each question type. So this is a specific type of logical reasoning question. This is called, so the question stem that we saw is asking you which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the argument. So in order to answer this question correctly, first of all, you have to understand what an argument is on the LSAT. What does the LSAT mean when it says weakens the argument? What do they mean by an argument? And then what do they mean by weaken? How do you weaken an argument? So an argument by itself is not a flaw. Flaws are definitely part of LSAT arguments, but the LSAT does have a really specific definition of an argument, right? When the LSAT talks about arguments, they are talking about something very specific. And I'm not going to go over this in a lot of detail because, again, we have these other free prep hour videos that you can watch on YouTube. And they, in those other ones, we do talk about specifically the definition of an argument, the specific definition that's used on the LSAT, what the LSAT means when the LSAT says argument. So you need to be familiar with this, right? If you're going to answer these questions effectively, you need to know what they're talking about when they say argument. And then how do you weaken an argument? How do we weaken a logical reasoning argument on the LSAT? So there's some good resources if you don't know the answers to these questions I'm asking. You can watch our LSAT free prep hours from July 2nd and July 22nd. Those 2, again, you can find these on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. Those in those 2 sessions from July 2nd and July 22nd, 2018, we cover specifically arguments on the LSAT, what an argument is, how to break arguments down, how to understand the components of an argument, all this kind of underlying stuff that you would need to understand in order to deal with arguments on the LSAT. You can also, and again, I'll put these links in the chat window when we're done, or they'll be in the video information when we publish the recording. But you can sign up for our free email series, The Brief, and we cover arguments pretty well in there. and how to weaken arguments, specifically this type of question. You can also attend session 1 of any of our in-person or live online LSAT courses for free. So these are all free resources, right? We're just mentioning the free resources here tonight. And these are all resources you can take advantage of to learn more about arguments and exactly what the LSAT means by an argument, and exactly what they mean by weakening an argument. So I'm not going to review all of that tonight. But if we look at this specific question, this specific argument, an argument consists of one important part of an argument is a conclusion. There's going to be some kind of claim, something that someone is trying to convince you is true. And in this particular example, this last sentence is the conclusion. I'm just going to put a C over here for conclusion. You see me write a little C here on the board. It means conclusion, the conclusion of this argument. So this last statement, therefore, psychological treatment lasting more than 6 months is more effective than shorter-term treatment. That's the conclusion of our argument. And an argument isn't just a conclusion. An argument also has support, premises. So these two sentences preceding the conclusion, of those responding who had received treatment for 6 months or less, 20% claim that treatment made things a lot better. That's one premise. Of those responding who had received longer treatment, 36% claim that treatment made things a lot better. That's the other premise. So the premises are like the evidence. And the person, whoever's making this argument, is presenting that evidence and wants us to believe that that evidence should convince us that the conclusion is true. This first statement is just kind of, we call it background information. For the purposes of this specific type of question of weakening an argument, we're not really too concerned about the background information. That just kind of gives us some context for the argument. So what we're really interested in here is the idea of, do these premises convince us that the conclusion is true? And so what are these premises saying? Notice the premises are kind of similar. This one premise is talking about people who had received treatment for 6 months or less. And the other one is talking about people who received longer treatment. And notice there's a difference here. We have, in these people who received treatment for 6 months or less, 20% claimed that the treatment made things a lot better. In the group who received longer treatment, 36% claimed that treatment made things a lot better. They're both claiming the same things, right? That the treatment made things a lot better. Both groups are making that same claim. So the big difference here is the difference between the length of treatment and how many, or what percentage of the people made this claim that things are a lot better. So based on this difference, based on these two premises comparing two different groups, we're drawing this conclusion that treatment lasting more than 6 months is more effective. Okay, so, Serene, you mentioned the idea of predicting an answer, of noting the flaw in this argument. And Serene, if you want to hop on the mic, if you want to click the unmute button, and you can, or you can answer in the chat window if you want, either way. What would you say is wrong with this argument? Because if we're going to weaken the argument, there has to be a crack in the argument for us to weaken it, right? If it was a perfect airtight argument, if it was a perfectly, convincing, what we call a valid argument, if we had a perfectly valid argument, then there would be no way to weaken it. But this is asking us to weaken the argument, so there must be a problem with it. Do you see what the problem is, Serene, with this argument? Does anybody see what the problem is?
They didn't come up with all the answers responding to that survey. So, and they made a conclusion based on, I'm guessing, 56% of the participants.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, they didn't base it on all of the responses. Now, realize that these are talking about two different groups. So it looks like you're adding these two together to get 56%. But it's a little different from that. If you look closely at what it's saying, they're comparing two different groups. We have one group who received treatment for 6 months or less. And out of all of those people, 20% made this claim. And then we have a totally separate group who received longer treatment. And out of that group, 36%. So these are two different groups with two, and we're saying something different about the two groups, a different number of people or a different percentage of, not different number of people, let's be specific, a different percentage of people in each group made this specific claim that things got better. So we're not going to add the numbers together. And it's okay to like compare two groups and say, hey, like there's a difference between these two groups. But let's look at exactly what the conclusion is saying. Yeah, Serene, did you want to say something else?
The number of people at the 36% of the second group might be, the number of those people might be actually less than the 20% of the first group.
Ah, yeah. So that's a really common, that's an LSAT thing, right? That's a common thing that they try to fool you with. They'll give you two groups and they'll tell you something about the percentage in each group, but do we know the actual number? Maybe, out of the, maybe the one group is much larger than the other, right? Maybe the people who had received treatment for 6 months or less, that's, 1,000 people. And maybe the people who had received longer treatment, it was only like 10 people. So yeah, it's always good to know. It's always great to notice not just what's there on the page, but what's missing. What haven't they told us? And that's very often, especially in a comparative argument like this, that's noticing what's missing from the comparison can often clue you into what's wrong with the argument. I see, Juliana, you're talking about finding an alternative explanation. Yeah, so very often these types of questions where there's a comparison and we're drawing a conclusion based on this comparison is it's about finding some kind of alternative. So good, you guys have some good ideas about how to read these questions and understand the arguments. Understand what we're looking at when we look at the stimulus here, when we look at this little paragraph they give us. So let's keep moving. Let's move on to the answer choices then with this understanding. And, I just want to pause here for a second. When I talk about having an effective process for each question type, so for this type of question where we're talking about arguments and weakening an argument, not everybody's going to take the time to do what we just did on every one of these questions. But you should, right? If you want to have an effective process, this is what you should be practicing. You should be practicing the ability to read this paragraph. And, I'm kind of helping us out a little bit by separating the sentences. And you want to try to read them that way. You want to consider each individual sentence and what is it telling you? What role is it playing in the argument? And you definitely want to understand what the conclusion is. What's the main point of the argument? And then what's the evidence that they're giving you to support the main point? So when you read these questions, when you're practicing on your own, doing, whatever practice that you're doing for the LSAT, when you read one of these questions, you want to make sure that you can read this way and break a question down this way, just as we've done here. It takes time at first. It's going to seem really slow at first, but with practice, you'll be able to read a question like this and within, 30 or 40 seconds have this understanding that we have right now. So that's the part of your process. Are you taking the time to actually read, not just read the paragraph and just blaze through it and just try to, get to the answer choices as fast as you can, but are you actually taking time to understand the argument that they're giving you and what's wrong with it? Okay, so now that we know some potential problems with the argument, let's look at the answer choices with the idea of weakening it in mind. Now, here's what I want you to do. When you look at the answer choices again, we're going to change things up a little bit. When you look at the answer choices again, I want you to just, in the chat window, type the letter for the answers. One or more answers can be just one, not the correct answer, but which answer seems the most wrong to you? Which answer are you most certain is wrong, is a wrong answer? Maybe there are two that you're really certain about. So put 2 letters in the chat window. But look at the answer choices again, and I want to know which ones are you most certain are wrong. Okay, I see some people kind of hating on A here. Yeah, A might seem like an appealing answer to some people. Of all the respondents who had received treatment for longer than 6 months, 10% said the treatment made things worse. Does that really weaken the argument? I mean, a lot of people might jump on A. You might look at answer choice A and say, oh, that sounds really good. But if you think about it, just because 10% said that treatment made things worse, we still have 36% saying that treatment made things a lot better. So yeah, I mean, there are always going to be some naysayers. There are always going to be some people who say, no, it made things worse. So that doesn't necessarily weaken the argument just because there are a couple of contrary opinions or some contrary evidence, some opposing evidence. Patients who had received treatment for longer than 6 months were more likely to respond to the survey than were those who had received treatment for a shorter time. Okay, now that might seem like it could weaken, right? I mean, I might leave that one around because maybe that's saying, hey, there are a lot more people responding to the survey. There's a difference in the number of people. Yeah, maybe that introduces some kind of bias in the data. So maybe I might leave that one around. How about C? Patients who feel that they are doing well in treatment tend to remain in treatment, while those who are doing poorly tend to quit earlier. So this gets into some alternative explanations. That might be an appealing answer choice too. And really, I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that. That could be right. That could somehow weaken the argument. I'm looking for answers that I know are wrong, that jump out at me immediately as wrong. So if I look at answer choice D, patients who are dissatisfied with their treatment were more likely to feel a need to express their feelings about it. So if you're dissatisfied, you're more likely to need to express your feelings and return the survey. People who are dissatisfied are more likely to return the survey. That doesn't really weaken the argument because we have evidence about people who say, hey, this made me feel better. And so I'm not sure how, people feeling dissatisfied being more likely to return the survey, how does that impact? The other thing this doesn't do is this doesn't tell me about a difference between the two groups. This would be something that applies to both groups. So it seems like it would apply to both groups equally. So I'm not sure how that impacts a comparison between one and the other. So D might be a good one to get rid of. Many psychologists encourage their patients to receive treatment for longer than 6 months. Does anybody see anything about E? Psychologists encourage their patients to receive treatment for longer than 6 months. What would that do to the argument? If we're saying, well, again, you could say, I don't think it's relevant at all because it's not talking about the difference between the two groups, really. Just because psychologists encourage their patients to receive treatment for longer than 6 months. But if anything, if psychologists encourage their patients to receive treatment for longer than 6 months, that seems like it would it really isn't relevant, but if it did anything, it seems like it would strengthen the argument, right? Like, well, yeah, or at least be more evidence towards the conclusion. So if anything, it's definitely not weakening, and really it's not relevant. So we're left with B and C. I'm going to kind of cut to the chase here because I want to get through a couple other questions, but the correct answer to this one is C, Charlie. Patients who feel that they are doing well in treatment tend to remain in treatment, while those who are doing poorly tend to quit earlier. So this is, notice what what the conclusion is kind of trying to sell us here. Does anybody recognize, I'm just curious, anybody recognize the flaw, that the actual flaw? There's actually a name for this flaw that you see in this argument. It's a classic logical fallacy. It's something that appears a lot in the LSAT. Does anybody recognize the flaw? Is anybody familiar with a correlation versus causation? The correlation does not prove causation. Notice that our conclusion is about a cause, right? The conclusion is making a claim of causation. It's saying that the treatment lasting more than 6 months is more effective, is causing better results, is causing things to be better. It's more effective. So that's a claim of causation, saying, hey, if you get treatment for more than 6 months, it's going to be more effective. It will cause a more effective outcome. And all of our premises, our evidence is all about correlation. All we're saying is, hey, these people who receive, there's a connection. There's some correlation between receiving longer treatment and claiming that the treatment made things better. That there's a greater correlation between longer treatment and reporting that things are better, versus a lower correlation between receiving less treatment and making things better. But we don't know why, right? The premises themselves don't tell us why that's happening. The conclusion is trying to claim it's happening because of the length of time. So, you mentioned, I think, Juliana, you mentioned earlier, alternative explanation. What's an alternative explanation? Well, maybe an alternative explanation is that people who are feeling better, or maybe people who feel that the treatment is more effective, or maybe people who are getting better treatment tend to stay at it longer, right? I mean, if you're happier with the results, you would be more likely to stick around and continue getting the treatment. So C is weakening the argument by saying, hey, maybe the causation's reversed. Maybe it's not the length of treatment that's causing the greater effectiveness. Maybe it's the more effective treatment that's causing people to stay in longer. So we're weakening the argument by suggesting that the claim, rather than the claim in the conclusion, that things are actually reversed. So that's why C is the correct answer. Now, the whole point here, though, is the big thing that I want you to take away from this is notice, once we had a good understanding of the argument itself, notice how a couple of these answer choices really stood out to you as wrong. Like, a couple of people jumped right on a couple of these answer choices as being wrong. And that's what you always want to have happen. In fact, when you first look at the answer choices, you always want to be looking for the answer choices that you know are wrong. It's the first thing that you always want to do when you look at answer choices. First thing I always do when I look at answer choices. I'm never asking myself, I'm never going to read answer choice A and say, okay, does it look right? I don't know. Let me look at B. Like, it's commonly the way we do things, right? As we go looking for the right answer. But you always want to look at the answer choices, and very first step should be eliminate the answer choices that you know are wrong. Because you can narrow things down really quickly that way. You can work much more quickly. Get rid of the answers. Get rid of the low-hanging fruit. Get rid of the answers that really jump out at you as wrong. And then you're spending your time more effectively focusing on the answers that are more likely to be correct, and deciding which one of those is actually correct. So again, as part of our process, as part of our way, and it seems a little bit counterintuitive, but if you look at the answer choices and the first thing you're doing is looking for right answers, you spend a lot more time thinking about each answer choice because you're trying to decide if it's right or not. If you shift your focus and just look for the answer choices that you know are wrong and get rid of those, cross those off. That's why I said it's always good when you're working on one of these questions, when we're working here in the free prep hour, and you're working at these questions, that we're looking at on the screen, have these letters on your paper. Have a piece of paper and write out A, B, C, D, E. So you can actively do that while you're working. Cross off the answer choices that you know are wrong. And you get rid of those quickly, and then you're narrowing down, you're limiting the amount of time you have to spend really thinking carefully about answers, trying to decide whether or not they're right. So process, right? Working wrong to right. That's always a big way to eliminate the time, kill the time vampires, right? And not waste time. Is because you can waste a lot of time following a process that is ineffective. Oh, I saw a question. Why is B not correct? Well, let's go back and look at answer choice B. Yeah, I kind of left you hanging with B. So patients who received treatment for longer than 6 months were more likely to respond to the survey than were those who had received treatment for a shorter time. So there are a couple of reasons why it's wrong. First of all, more likely to respond to the survey. So how much of a difference is that? Does it mean that, like, they were twice as likely, 10 times more likely? Like, we don't know. What does more likely mean? It could be just like you had 50 patients who received treatment for longer than 6 months who replied, and 49 who received shorter treatment. That would be more likely, right? So more likely is very indefinite. We don't know how much that means, and so it doesn't really weaken very much. You would have to add, notice that in your own mind, you have to add the assumption that it's a big difference or it's a significant difference. It just says more likely. It doesn't say significantly more likely. And even if it said that, that might not be a problem because, okay, we have more people saying, it's still, the premises are dealing with percentages. So even if there's a significant difference, it might not be enough to counter the idea that, hey, only 20% of those who received treatment for 6 months or less said that they, felt much better. It's a pretty significant difference. 36% more of those who had longer treatment said they made things a lot better. So we don't know what more likely means, and we don't know if it's enough to actually counter the differences we see in the percentages. A difference in numbers doesn't actually, tell us much when what we're told in the evidence is about a difference in percentages. So that's why. That's why B is incorrect. You have to add a lot of assumptions. Doesn't state that people responded positively or negatively. Well, we know the percentages already. Yeah, it's not so much that the answer choice B doesn't state that they responded positively or negatively. I think the problem with B is that we don't know how much of a difference that makes. Right? You have to add a lot of assumptions to answer choice B to make it relevant or to make it actually weaken the argument. Whereas C presents a pretty straightforward challenge to the argument, the reversed causation. So having an effective process for every question type, right? That's a big step in our quest to use our time effectively. Again, know when you see a question like this, which of the following most seriously weakens the argument? Okay, what's an argument? What do I have to do? How am I specifically reading that stimulus, that paragraph? What information do I need to get out of that so that I can look at the answer choices effectively? And then when you look through the answer choices, work wrong to right, right? Your first goal is always to look for wrong answers. Get rid of as many answers that you know are wrong as possible. As many answers as possible that you know are wrong. Eliminate those first. And then go back and look at the remaining answers and look at those more closely. So learning to recognize why wrong answers are wrong is a really specific part. Always try to take the time when you're reviewing a question, just like we did. Try to go back and specifically talk about the wrong answers. Examine the wrong answers. Make sure you understand why the wrong. So I'm glad you answered that. You asked that question. Why is B wrong? Make sure you're asking yourself that question. Make sure you know exactly why the wrong answers are wrong. Don't just focus on the right answer and why the right answer is right. All right, so let's look at some more. Let's look at another question and talk about some more techniques we can use here to kill some time vampires. All right, I'll give you, again, minute and 20 to work on this question. Let's see how we do with this one. All right, that was a minute and 20 seconds. If you came up with an answer, go ahead and put your answer in the chat window, please, if you would. Right. Okay, a couple answers coming in. So again, let's talk about our process for this one. Let's talk about the steps we're going to follow. This is the same question type, right? Which of the following, if true, would most weaken the ethicist's argument? So we need to understand, what is the argument? What is the, first of all, what's the main point here? What's the conclusion, the claim that this person is making? Somebody, if you would, in the chat window, give me the first, if you would, just write the first couple words of the conclusion of this argument. If you know what the conclusion is of the argument. Okay. Consumption of meat is wrong morally. Okay. Yeah, this last sentence, right? This last sentence, and again, I just kind of broke things down here. We must accept the fact that consumption of meat will soon be morally unacceptable. So a little bit more specific. Serene, you're on the right track. It's a good paraphrase. If we wanted to be completely specific, the conclusion is that it will soon be morally unacceptable. And so what's the evidence for that? Well, it's kind of everything else. Animals raised on grain must be fed 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat. Pound of meat is more nutritious. And actually, this little part, we can eliminate this part about the pound of meat being more nutritious. It's kind of an opposing point. Notice that our conclusion actually ends up contradicting that. So for purposes of understanding the argument or looking to weaken the argument, we don't need to consider that. We're just looking for the evidence that's given and the conclusion based on the evidence. So the evidence is, okay, it takes 16 pounds of grain to produce a pound of meat, but 16 pounds of grain could feed many more people than a pound of meat. So we can take that 16 pounds of grain and just feed people instead. And then we have some other factors going on here, right? Grain yields are leveling off. Large areas of farmland going out of production and population expanding. So we should not, it makes it sound like, hey, we really should just be taking this grain and instead of feeding it, using it to produce beef, produce meat, we should just be feeding people with the meat. So we have to accept the fact that consumption of meat will be morally unacceptable. So again, breaking this argument down, labeling everything, this is the conclusion of the argument, and these are my premises. Okay, not just that those 16 pounds of grain could feed a lot more people, not just that, but also the fact that, hey, we're maybe getting a little short on grain here. Grain yields are leveling off. Farmland's going out of production, and we have more people to feed. So all these things combined convince us, or according to the ethicist, should convince us that consumption of meat will be unacceptable. So I want everybody to take a moment. You can put it in the chat window if you want, or just think about it. What's wrong with the argument? Do you see a problem with the argument? Can you predict a way to weaken this argument? So you always want to try to take a minute to do that. But at a minimum, again, you need to, if you're going to weaken the argument, you need to understand what the argument is. And I find that this is a step that a lot of people skip. A lot of people really gloss over this step and don't really take the time to just understand what the argument is, right? What is the conclusion? What is the support? How is this argument being put together? Because that's always what we're trying to weaken. We're trying to weaken the connection between the premises and the conclusion. Do these premises, do these evidence actually support this conclusion, actually convince us that the conclusion is true? That's what we're trying to weaken. So what I'm going to do for this question, just to focus on something a little more specific, I'm just going to show you two answer choices. And one of these two answer choices is correct. So take a look at these two answer choices, and I think they're kind of similar. So this is a really common situation that people end up in. I hear people say this all the time. I can get down to two answer choices. I can usually eliminate three of the answer choices, and I end up getting down to two, but then I have trouble choosing the right one. Does anybody have that problem? Give me a yes in the chat window. Yeah, I see a yes right away, right? It's a very common problem. Sometimes, yeah. So how do you deal with that? Like, let's not even worry right now about what the correct answer is, but yeah, that's why this often, and you, Feifei, you exactly hit why we have this problem. Said the wrong answer is too attractive. So the LSAT, the test writers do this intentionally. Very often, they're going to give you a correct answer and then what we call a trap answer. They're going to give you another answer that's not correct but is very attractive. And that's why people very often end up in this situation where you're down to 2 and you have to choose the correct answer between these 2 remaining answers. So how do we deal with that question? How do we deal with that problem? How do we deal with that? How do you arrive? What do you do when you're down to 2 answer choices like this and you have to choose one? And let's just say, for argument's sake, I know a couple people found some of the answer choices kind of attractive, but let's say, just for the sake of this exercise, that you were able to pretty quickly eliminate A and C and E, and you're just left with B and D. So this is the situation we're facing. So yeah, I like what you're saying, Serene. You want to connect them to the premises and the conclusion. So that's what I would do, is go back first and look at the premises and conclusion again. Just read through the argument again really quickly and remind myself of the premises and the conclusion. And then I'm going to look at each answer choice again. And this is a place where, remember I said earlier that a lot of people think the answer, the solution, is to just go faster, right? You got to go as fast as possible all the time. But this is one of those times where if you want to get questions right, if you really want to do a better job of choosing between 2 answer choices, you need to be able to slow down a little bit at this point. So I'm going to read these answer choices a little more slowly. I'm going to go back, read my stimulus again, and then read the answer choices a little more slowly, and then see if I can make a decision between them. So Serene, you're saying D. Why is D correct and why is B wrong? Do you want to hop on the mic again and help me with that? What's your explanation for your choice?
Okay. Because D is saying that the reason why the farmland is going out of business is because of moving to metropolitan areas.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm thinking. And if we could reverse that trend by choosing to live in areas that are already urban, I'm not positive, but this is what I'm doing.
Sounds better. All right. So why is B wrong then? What is wrong with answer choice B? If D is looking good to you, can you see something wrong with answer choice B?
Because B is saying the grass that the animal are fed is not suitable for any other kind of farming. They're talking about farming, not human consumption.
Mm-hmm. What are humans consuming? You're correct. They're talking about farming, but not
because the first premise is saying 1 pound of meat takes 16 pounds of grains to produce. So it's really not related to. So it's still gonna take.
Where does grain come from?
Huh?
Where does grain come from?
Grain. Yeah, from grass, the farm.
From farms, right? It's farms. Yeah. You grow it on a farm, right? Okay. Yeah. So the problem here is we're growing all this grain on farms, and then we're feeding it to animals instead of feeding it to people. But we could feed way more people if we just fed them the grain, so we shouldn't be eating meat at all. Notice that jump from, hey, there's a problem with feeding animals grain, we should be feeding it to people instead. We're jumping from that to, oh, we shouldn't eat meat at all. Well, you know, again, think about alternatives. What if we could raise meat without the grain? Well, you know, and one thing to keep in mind is when we talk about weakening the argument, it doesn't say destroy the argument. We want to cast doubt on the argument. So I'm going to say that answer choice B, like you're right, answer choice D is a really appealing answer because it seems to give us a solution to a problem that's part of the argument. But notice what B is doing, why B is also appealing. Because it's just saying, hey, we don't need grain. Like, we don't need grain to, you know, animals raised on grain must be fed 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat. But if B is true, cattle or sheep can be raised on grass. We don't need the grain to raise the animals. So if we don't need grain to raise the animals, if we raise grass, if we can raise them on grass instead, then guess what? These premises don't really support the conclusion that we shouldn't eat meat at all. It's a very extreme conclusion, right? We shouldn't eat meat at all. So can you see why B is kind of appealing?
Mhm.
Am I convincing you?
Yes, I missed that.
Okay. So now here's the thing. If B is appealing, can we find something wrong with D? If I was to suggest that B is the right answer, then what makes D wrong? Why is D wrong? Anybody else who wants to jump in too? Anybody who has an opinion about this on the chat window or hop on the mic, join the conversation. What's wrong with D? Why does D not weaken the argument as much?
I think the word urban, not rural, maybe.
Yeah, look at where we say prime farmland near metropolitan areas is being lost rapidly. So, but what are my premises about? My premises are about large areas of farmland going out of production each year. So, again, you don't have to be a farmer to do well on the LSAT. The LSAT's testing your ability to notice details. And our premises are saying large areas of farmland going out of production each year. So, okay, it seems like D is saying, well, yeah, we can solve that problem, right? We could reverse this trend by choosing to live in areas that are already urban. But wait a minute, how much of these large areas of farmland that are going out of production, is that all this prime farmland near metropolitan areas? Like, we don't know. Prime farmland near metropolitan areas, that could be like a couple fields outside of New York City or something, right? One farmer has a couple fields outside of New York City, and somebody wants to turn it into a development, right? So we don't know what the relationship is between the prime farmland near metropolitan areas and these large areas of farmland going out of production. So anytime that an answer choice like this is much more specific than the evidence we're given, how do we know that this subject that they're talking about, this farmland being talked about in answer choice D, is related or significant compared to these large areas of farmland? So there's a hole in answer choice D. B and D are both really good possibilities. Let's see what Juliana's saying. D seems unsustainable as a solution and ultimately could lead to the same issue of meat affecting the concerns. So I guess you could go even further and say we could reverse the trend by choosing to live in areas that are already urban. But are people going to choose that? And for how long? How long can we reverse that trend? Whereas B does seem like a more permanent solution. So unsustainable, Juliana. Like, how long is that going to last? But I think a big, so there are a number of ways sometimes to poke holes in these arguments. But a quick way to do it sometimes is to notice when an answer choice is adding details that makes it like very, very specific. And again, you have to make an assumption. So there's an additional gap between this answer choice and the premise that it seems related to. A pretty significant gap that we would have to assume is that we can fill. So, again, we're seeing something similar in both of these questions. We're seeing answer choices that can be appealing. Like somebody said, why was B wrong in that last question we looked at? Why is D wrong in this one? So we very often run into these situations where there are two appealing answer choices, and just simply noticing that you have to make some assumptions in order for one of those answer choices. It's one of the best things you can do to get better in these questions and logical reasoning is to notice when you're having to fill in the gaps, when you're having to make assumptions to make an answer choice work. And very often there'll be one answer choice that you have to make more assumptions with and one that you don't have to make as many assumptions with. But the trick to seeing that sometimes is really understanding the argument itself, so that you can see that answer choice B is actually relevant. I see another question in the chat window. Could you give a suggestion to overcome this overwhelming amount of information in an LSAT question? You read this and get so overwhelmed. Yeah, so my suggestion is just based on what we've talked about first. First of all, you notice what I'm doing. I'll give you a couple suggestions. It's a really good question, a very common problem. I'm going to give you a couple suggestions. So one is, if you notice what I'm doing with these questions when we look at them, this is more like the way things appear on the LSAT, right? It's this one big paragraph all like plopped together. So notice what I'm doing when we talk about these questions is I'm breaking the stimulus, the paragraph, apart into separate sentences or even separate statements. And it's not going to look like this on your test paper, but this is the way you should be reading. You want to, and you know, again, remember what I said earlier, how everybody wants to go fast all the time. You need to know when to slow down and pause a little bit. So you might find that it helps to you know, read a sentence and pause for a second. Think about that one sentence. Like what I'm usually doing when I read this is I read this sentence and I'm thinking, okay, what role does that play? I know I'm dealing with an argument. I also always read the question stem first. That's something that's really helpful. Just reading this question stem, I know there's an argument that I have to weaken. So as I read each sentence, I'm thinking, what role does that play in the argument? And I read this and, you know, like, well, that sounds like, you know, some factual information. That's probably evidence. This also sounds like factual information. This kind of like, then I read this whole last sentence and I go, oh, this sounds like the claim, the conclusion. This sounds like the thing that someone's trying to convince me or the ethicist is trying to convince me of. So, and especially once you identify that claim, that conclusion, you'll often find that the rest of it falls into place. So sometimes I do read the whole stimulus twice. I might read it like looking for the conclusion, and then once I find the conclusion, I go back and look through everything again to you know, make sure or see which specific statements are the evidence, the support for that conclusion. Then it makes more sense. So that may be a really useful thing for you to do, is read through the paragraph. And if it is, if the question stem mentions an argument or reasoning, and you're trying to strengthen, weaken, or it's one of what we call an assumption family question, any of the questions that deal with arguments, read through and look for the conclusion first, and then go back and read it again and see how everything else relates to that conclusion. So just identifying the conclusion first can be really effective. I always, and Serene, to answer your question, I always recommend reading the question stem first. It takes a little bit of practice to train yourself to do that, but the reason is because the different questions are going to ask you to do different things. And some of these questions don't even involve arguments. So I'm going to read this paragraph differently based on what the question's asking me to do. If it's asking about an argument, I'm going to read this looking for an argument. Other questions are just saying like, which of the following is must, if the statements above are true, which of the following must be true? What we call an inference question. There's no argument there. I'm just trying to understand these statements and see which of these answer choices can be inferred based on that. So because you're going to do different things based on what the question's asking, it's always a good idea to read the question first. And so that may help you, you know, process the information better. And then, like we just said, you know, again, what I did on the screen here is something that you can do yourself while you're reading in your mind, pausing after each statement and thinking about it for just a second. Like, what is that? Is that the conclusion? Is that the conclusion? Is that conclusion? Oh yeah, that last thing. And the conclusion can be in many different places in an argument, right? It could be first, it could be last, it could be in the middle. Once you find that conclusion, then go back and see if you can relate everything else, you know, identify the evidence supporting the conclusion. Another way to process the information really effectively that we just talked about a little earlier, and to deal with the large amount of information, is what I mentioned earlier, which is when you look at the answer choices, read each answer choice just looking for something that you know is wrong. That's all you care about first, is which of these answer choices are definitely wrong. And if you can eliminate 3 or even 2 answer choices that you know are definitely wrong, just get rid of those quickly. That limits the amount of information you have to think about. And then you can go back again and look at the remaining answer choices and just focus on those. So a lot of, you know, the answer to your question, Pepe, the suggestion to overcome the overwhelming amount of information really plays into what we've been talking about all along, which is having a clear process, having a step-by-step approach to these questions. I know a lot of people are going to read these and just try to take in all the information as fast as they can. Try to read the whole stimulus and understand this whole paragraph, take in the whole block of information, and then go looking through the answer choices for something that looks right. And then, yeah, you do get overwhelmed. So break things down step by step. Think about the way we've been breaking these questions down step by step, and take that step-by-step approach. So just to summarize things a little bit, how to kill these time vampires that we're talking about. Have an effective process for every question type. Think about, not just what's the right answer, but what are the steps that you're going to follow to get to the right answer? That's always what's important. Really try to develop a good, clear process. And again, I'll mention in a moment some of the free resources we have, like our brief email series, these free prep hours. And that's a lot of what we focus on is the process that you should follow, the step-by-step process that you should follow to answer these questions. Think about what you're going to do when you're down to 2 answer choices. Like, what are the steps? Think about what we just did with that farming and meat question. What were the steps that we followed to when you're down to 2 to arrive at the correct answer? One of the things we did was slow down a little bit. We went back and looked at the argument again, right? Looked at the stimulus again. Just go back and reread that quickly. Review the argument core, the premises and the conclusion. And then go back and reread each answer choice a little more slowly. I mean, notice, Serena, I think one of the things you said was like, oh, I didn't notice that the first time that I read it. Such a common thing. You'll find yourself, seeing that again and again, where you'll read an answer choice, you'll go back and read it later. Like, you'll work through a question timed, and then you go back and read the answer choices later, and you go, oh, I didn't see that the first time. Well, maybe that tells you that you're just going too fast. Right? You're trying to read too fast. So there are times when it is really good to slow down, like when you're trying to decide between 2 answer choices. And then the last one, know when to guess and move on. We didn't talk too much about guessing in this session, but that's a big part of your timing strategy. A lot of people have this idea that you have to answer every question no matter how long it takes. And that's not the way to boost your score. That's the way to end up spending 3 or 4 minutes on a really difficult question that you might get wrong anyway. It's not hard to spend 3 or 4 minutes on an LSAT question and still get it wrong. And if you do that 2 or 3 times, I mean, you've just, taken up half your time on 2 or 3 questions, or, even a third of your time on 2 or 3 questions. You can't do that. So always being willing to guess and move on. Take your best guess and move on. Especially if you get down to 2 answer choices, like we were, with that one question a couple moments ago. If you're down to 2 answer choices and, you've gone back and looked at the stimulus again, and you've gone back and looked at these 2 answer choices again, read them a little more slowly, and you don't see a difference, you're still not sure which one is right, don't spend another 2 or 3 minutes looking back and forth, reading each of them 3 or 4 more times. It's not going to get you anywhere. Be willing to take a guess and move on. Take your best guess and move on. That'll, you might not get this question right, but it'll free up time. It'll help you avoid spinning your wheels and wasting time that you could be spending answering an easier question. Later questions are not always harder on the LSAT. The questions don't get progressively harder. They might get harder, and then there's an easier one, and a little harder, and maybe the last couple are a little easier. So you always want to notice when you're getting stuck on a question and be willing to guess and move on. Each question is only worth 1 point. So these are some specific ways to kill the time vampires on the LSAT. Having an effective process. Know what to do in the common situations that slow people down, like when you're having to choose between two appealing answer choices. Try to go fast. Yeah, you have to work efficiently, but also know when to slow down, when it's more effective to slow down and read things a little more carefully. And then be willing to guess. So it's not just about working faster, using your time wisely. And if your goal is to answer every question correctly, no matter what, I'm going to, spend as much time as I need to. I'm going to stick with this question. I've already spent a minute on this question. I'm just going to stick with it no matter how long that takes. That's not going to be an effective way to increase your score. That's a way to run out of time at the end and not have a chance to answer those last 5 questions, when maybe a couple of them would actually be easier to answer than that one you spent 2 or 3 minutes on. So your goal is never to just work through the questions one at a time. Your goal is to try to answer the easiest questions first. You can always, if you have time at the end, go back and answer questions that you skipped, but you do need to be willing to take a guess every once in a while and guess and move on. All right, so with that being said, to wrap things up a little bit, like I said, we do these free prep hours twice a month, and we have some other free resources that you can take advantage of. So I'm going to put this information in the chat window for those who are here live. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then this information about our free resources, the links to our free resources, should be in the details, the information about the video. Come on and check out one of our live in-person or live online LSAT classes. Check out the free resources. Check out the brief email series. If you haven't signed up for that yet, you get an email in your inbox every day or every other day, depending on what you sign up for. That'll give you some good information, and it goes into quite a bit of detail. It doesn't go into as much detail as our strategy guides. It doesn't go into as much detail as our classes do, as our class sessions do. But the brief email series does give you a lot of good information and an overview of these different question types and some of the topics that we talked about now. Check out, and if you're interested in self-study, if you're looking for some self-study options, we just came out with a great resource called the LSAT 5-pound book. And it is literally 5 pounds of LSAT drills. They're not actual LSAT questions, but they're drills. They're little mini drills that help you develop some of these skills that we're talking about here, and the other skills in reading comprehension and logic games, logical reasoning. They're going to help you succeed on the LSAT. So 5-pound book of LSAT questions. You can find information about that on our website too. Overwhelmed by that. Yeah, it really is 5 pounds. And so, yeah, that's it. If anybody else so what I'm going to do, like I said, like I promised, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up for the night for our video. So I'll go ahead and anybody who's watching this from home, I will go ahead and say thank you. Thanks for checking in. Check out our other videos on YouTube, our other free prep hour videos. And we do this twice a month. So if you want to attend one of these live and come on and join the conversation, then go to our website and look up the upcoming courses and free workshops and join one of our live, our free prep hours. But with that being said,